All right. So this morning's lesson tonight. What have you done? Looking at the downfall of Saul. Now you recall a few weeks ago we looked at how that the children of Israel wanted a king, and they wanted to be like all the nations around them. And so they begged and begged and begged, give us a king, give us a king. And one of the reasons they wanted a king was so that he may go and fight our battles for us. Of course, Samuel pointed out to them, they already had a king. God was their king. He fought their battles for them. As long as they were faithful, he fought every battle for them, and he took care of them tremendously. Well, God told Samuel, he said, don't worry about it. Go ahead, give him a king. But it's going to be a king that I choose. And God chose Saul. And at that time, Saul was a man who was humble in heart. He was a man who was thoughtful and considerate. He had a lot of good qualities about him. But it wasn't long until Saul started his downfall. Matter of fact, we're going to look tonight at that. You'll notice it only took 2 years. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, from the reading this morning that Jeff read, you'll notice that at the beginning of the chapter it says, now Saul had reigned for a year, and then when 2 years came, he went and made war against the Philistines. And notice what happened. As he went to make war with the Philistines, you'll notice that he knew that Samuel was going to be coming. Samuel said, I'll be there in 7 days. And of course, the people were getting scared because Saul and Jonathan, they had between them 3,000 men. Now you might say, well, that sounds like a lot, but not really when you look at how many the Philistines had. They had, I believe it was 60,000 horsemen. Then a bunch of people on chariots. And then a bunch of people, it said, innumerable number of people. I mean, can you imagine? 3,000, and you look out and you see, just thousands and thousands and thousands of people. That would be scary. And so several of the people started to go away, and Saul was like, oh, I've got to do something. I've got to do something. Samuel's not here. He said he'd be here in 7 days. So on that last day, when Samuel was supposed to be there, Saul's like, I can't wait any longer. He says, I haven't made supplication to the Lord. So he says, bring the sacrifice to me. And he offered the sacrifice. He was not authorized to offer the sacrifice. That was not his job. You see, Saul was a king, not a prophet. So it was not his job to offer the sacrifice. And so he began his downfall. Now, of course, we notice that when Saul was chosen, he was a humble man. We see this in 1 Samuel 9 and 10. We find that Samuel warned Israel what kind of situation they were going to be in when they got a king. He said, when you get a king, he's going to rule over you. He's going to take your sons and put them into his military. He's going to take your daughters, and they're going to be perfumers and cooks and maidservants and what have you. This is what he's going to do. They're like, well, we want a king anyway. So they got one. So Saul did choose his men, and he went to war. However, Saul was, as we talked about just a second ago, he was impatient. He was waiting the 7 days that Samuel said, and on that last day when Samuel was supposed to arrive, and it seems to me by the reading of the scripture, and let's turn over there for just a moment, and we'll re-look at that. 1 Samuel chapter 13. I want you to notice. It says in verse 8, then he waited 7 days according to the time set by Samuel. In other words, Samuel says, I'll be there 7 days from now. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. They were becoming afraid, and some of them had left. They'd crossed the river into Gad. They'd gone up in the mountains. They were just running off. So Saul said, bring a burnt offering and peace offerings here to me. And he offered the burnt offering. Now it happened as soon as he had finished presenting the burnt offering that Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him that he might greet him. Now isn't that something? The idea that I get here is that on that very day that Samuel said he would arrive, he arrived on that day. Maybe not early in the morning like Saul wanted, but he arrived that day. A lot of times I'm sure we've probably all had something like this happen where, maybe we're going to have internet installed at the house or telephone or, cable or something like that. And what do they tell you? They say, well, we'll be there sometime on this day, right? Sometimes they'll say, well, he'll be there between 8 and noon. That's a 4-hour window, right? Now, have you ever had it come up to where they actually show up there first thing in the morning? Not usually. We've never had that happen. Usually they show up somewhere towards the latter end of that time frame, and that's pretty normal. I don't know. Do they do that with the utilities departments too, Randy? They will be there sometimes. We'll be there between 8 and noon. They show up at 11:59, right? It happens sometimes. And that's what we have going on here. Samuel says, I'm going to be there in 7 days. Well, come 7 days, Saul's like, I got to go. We got to get this done. So he took it upon himself. And what happens sometimes when we take it upon ourselves? We get ourselves in trouble, don't we? He was impatient. But what made him do it? When Samuel came to him, you'll notice in that very next verse, when he came, it says, and Samuel said, what have you done? Samuel knew right away what Saul had done, didn't he? But he says, what have you done? Saul said, when I saw that the people were scattered from me and that they did not come within the days appointed, and that you did not come in the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered together at Michmash, then I said, the Philistines will now come down upon me at Gilgal, and I have not made supplication to the Lord. Therefore I felt compelled, and I offered a burnt offering. So you'll notice that when Samuel asked him, what have you done? He's implying you knew what the commandment was. You knew our agreement. Now, don't we do that with our children sometimes? We've told our children exactly what they're supposed to do. And I know when I was growing up, I heard it a million times. Michael, this is what you're supposed to do. And then if I didn't do it, or if I didn't do it correctly, next time I saw my daddy or my mama, what did they say? What have you done? You didn't do what I told you to do. We've all experienced it. Well, here, Saul didn't do what he was told to do. Saul let his emotions get in the way. As we just read there in verses 11 and 12, you'll notice that he had an intense fear because the people were running away. Now, he's looking at this huge army. And here he had, total of 3,000 men. Well, he had 2,000 of them, and Jonathan had another 1,000 elsewhere. So he had 2,000 men, and I think in the end he ended up with like 600 men to go into battle. That's a huge difference, isn't it? But I want you to think about this. Shouldn't Saul have known the history of his people and their dealings with God? How many times did God over history go through and he fought their battles for the people? He told them exactly what they should do, and they had to just follow him. And I mean, look at when Gideon, you remember when Gideon was going up against his enemies? What happened? God said, you got too many people. We got to narrow this down. And eventually got down to 300 men. 300 against this huge army. And what happened? They prevailed because God was with them, because they followed God's commands. Don't you think that Saul would have known about that? Absolutely. But he was afraid. And of course, he was thinking like maybe they sometimes did. They thought, well, I've got to make supplication. That means I've got to, make my offering before God. And maybe he thought of it like a ritual. Before I go into battle, this is what we do. We make supplication. Let's check the boxes. Well, we've got some men together. Check. We've got some swords and spears. Check. Now, I don't know how they had many swords and spears in this one. I believe they only had 2 swords among them. which is pretty bad, but that was the situation. But nonetheless, they go through two swords. We're good, you know. But we haven't made supplication yet. What are we going to do? We can't go into battle without making supplication. We've got to go supplication check, right? That's not your job, Saul. But he did it anyway. And you'll notice the phrase he uses. He says, I felt compelled. Now, feeling compelled is not always a bad thing. How many of us feel compelled to get up on Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday night to show up here? I feel pretty compelled to do that, don't you? That's a good kind of compelling. How many of us feel compelled when we see someone in need to want to help them? That's a good compulsion to have. But notice here what he's saying. He's saying, Samuel, I felt compelled to violate God's commandment because you weren't following through. He was even playing the blame game. He said, you didn't show up on time. So if you ain't going to do it, I got to do it. Not a good situation. You know, when we look at things within the church, I have heard of situations, thankfully not been in one, but I've heard of situations where maybe in a congregation, particularly a small congregation like we have here, you know, in a situation where maybe several of the men might be sick and, you know, and who knows, it could happen. It could happen one Sunday, we all show up and, you know, maybe all the men are sick or something. And so it's just the ladies. But then maybe some other men who are visitors show up. Then what happens? Ooh, we got some situation going on, right? You know, maybe Tammy says, well, I'm here, Michael's not here, Richard's not here, Tommy's not here, Randy's not here, Jeff's not here, Ronnie's not here, Aaron and Ty's not here. We ain't got a man here at all. So Tammy says, I feel compelled to preach. Let me tell you, she can preach, y'all. She preaches to me sometimes. A red-headed preacher. But would she be okay in doing that with visiting men in the assembly? No. Now, if it's just women, that's a whole nother story. But what if she says, well, I felt compelled, there was no men here? Amy, it's not your job. You know, sometimes we overstep, don't we? We step into somebody else's job when it's not our job. And it gets us in trouble. That's what Saul did. It got him in trouble. You'll notice what Samuel says to him next. After he's given his, what I call his lame excuse. In verse 13, it says, and Samuel said to him, you have done foolishly. You've done foolishly. Kind of like maybe, kind of reminds me of Mr. T. You remember Mr. T? Talking about what a fool somebody is. Here he is. He's the fool, right? Saul played the fool. He did foolishly. That means the idea that he was doing something he knew he wasn't supposed to do. And of course, Samuel says, you have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. He says, you realize there are consequences for what you have done? You remember when Moses was leading the people through the wilderness, and they came to Mamre and they needed some water? And you recall God told Moses, he says, Moses, speak to the rock and bring out water. Moses was frustrated, wasn't he? He was dealing with those hard-headed, stiff-necked Jews, and he was frustrated. And what did Moses do? He said, bam, he struck the rock, and water came out. And then he says, see what I had to do for you? And I'm paraphrasing. Problem was, it wasn't Moses who did that, was it? He didn't give God the glory. He overstepped. He transgressed. Now, what was the result of that? What were the consequences for that? Consequences were Moses didn't get to go into the promised land. Moses got to get up on the mountain, and he got to look over into it, and he could see it, but he couldn't go in. That's a pretty bad situation. So here, the consequence for Saul is, Saul, God would have established your kingdom forever. You would have been your lineage. You messed it up. You didn't obey God's command. You went too far. You overstepped. And the consequence is God's going to take this kingdom from you. He says in verse 14, but now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. Wow. So he's just gotten really bad news. I mean, can you imagine what Saul's thinking right now? He's like, I didn't want this job in the first place, and here I am now king. I've been king for 2 years. I've been doing pretty good, and now I lost it all. Sometimes there are consequences for our sin that happen even in this life. Think about those who get out and engage in drunkenness and then get behind the wheel. Sometimes they kill someone else. Sometimes they kill someone they love. Sometimes they kill sometimes they kill a whole family. Is there consequence for that sin? Yes, very real consequences. See, the Bible tells us there are consequences for our sin. And of course, God is seeking someone after his own heart. Now, we know from Scripture that someone after his own heart is a man named David, which we've studied before, and we know that David was one who was, you recall when Samuel went to the house of Jesse, and he looked over Jesse's sons, and he saw Eliab, and here's Eliab, this tall, really strong and impressive, mighty man of valor, the Bible describes him. And he says, oh, surely this is God's anointed. And God says, no. God doesn't look at people like you look at people. He says, God looks at the heart. And so God said, this is not him. And all the other sons went through, this is not him, this is not him, this is not him. It got to the point where Samuel got down there to the last little bit, and he asked Jesse, he says, Jesse, do you have any more sons? He's like, well, I've got one. The little one, he's out there with the sheep. Bring him in. And he looked at him and said, this is the one. It was David, a man after God's own heart. But you see, sometimes we do foolishly. Sometimes we're a lot like Saul. Sometimes we take things upon ourselves that's not our job to do. We step beyond. Sometimes we just disobey. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 13 and 14, the Bible tells us that the whole duty of man is to do what? Fear God and keep his commandments. That's it. Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. If you want to be my friend, keep my commandments. Over and over and over, the Bible says, keep God's commandments. Now, does that mean at times we might feel some, for lack of a better way to put it, we might feel some angst about things not getting done, maybe in the time we think they should get done? Could be. Could be. But at the same time, we need to realize we each have a role to play and a job to do, and we each have to obey God's commands. I want you to notice also that there are consequences for disobeying God. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 8 through 10, you'll find there that those who do not obey God, those who do not obey God's commandments, they are going to be sent away from him in flaming fire. There are eternal consequences, more than just what Saul suffered with his losing the kingdom. There are eternal consequences. And so I want to ask you, are you a person after God's own heart? Now, what does that mean? That means that when you find out that you're wrong, you change. When you encounter something new, you look at it and say, what's right? What does God want me to do here? That's a person after God's own heart. You know, we were talking on the way home a little bit about what would have happened. You know, what would have happened if Bathsheba, when she was called for by David, you recall how David was looking over and he's watching Bathsheba take a bath and things, and he says, hey, bring that one to me. What would have happened if she'd have said, I don't care if you are the king. This ain't right and I ain't going to do it. Wouldn't that have made a huge difference? Was she guilty too? Yes, she was. Now, I don't know. Maybe she was thinking, if I don't go, the king will kill me. You know what? It's better to die pure than to go into sin, right? What if? There's a lot of what ifs I wonder about. But what if? This morning we talked about what if Adam and Eve had never sinned. What if? Be a whole different world today, wouldn't it? If there had never been sin entered in. See, when we're a person after God's own heart, and we're going to think about the what ifs before we jump into them. Tonight, there may be someone here that's needed the invitation. Maybe to come to Christ for the first time, put him on in baptism, or perhaps you need to come back. Won't you please come while together we stand and sing.